Hello and welcome back to session 3 of the Lent course Prayer and Discernment, the Ignatian Way, that we're holding at St Mary's, Marshalswick. We've been learning about finding God in all things over the last couple of weeks. The first week we learnt a stilling exercise, and the second week, last week, we looked at the examen, the prayer of review as is also known, that helps us to look back over our days and help us to find the gifts of God in them. This week we're going to go a bit deeper into the prayer of the examen. When we look back over our days, we're looking for what Ignatius calls consolations and desolations. And at first, when we start this prayer, we keep it fairly simple. We look for the things that are obviously good and things that we can be grateful for in our days. And we look for the things that were clearly difficult and that we need to hand over to God in our days. And that's a really good place to start with the examen. And it's also a lovely prayer to do with children. They can often grasp that and do that really easily. And it's a lovely way to introduce prayer to younger ones. And of course, if it's been a difficult day, then we just stay with the things that console. So we stay with the good things. As we go further into the examen, we can begin to acknowledge that, of course, life is a bit more complicated than good or bad, or happy or sad, that often there's a real subtlety between the difference between those things. So as we go deeper into the prayer of examen, we're going to explore some of those subtleties together. This is what Ignatius of Loyola calls the discernment of spirits, and it's what he spent a great deal of time thinking about and writing about. Before we kind of look at that in a bit more detail together, let's remind ourselves of the story that brought Ignatius to this point, because it's really significant as to how we get to discernment. Remember that Ignatius, as a young man, was wounded very badly in the Battle of Pamplona in 1521, and he spent months convalescing, lying in bed with really nothing to do at all. He had one book to read, which was a book on the life of the saints. And other than that, he would daydream. He loved to daydream, he had a great imagination, and one of his daydreams was to fantasize about great exploits on the battlefield, daring deeds, and winning the admiration of women around him. And the other daydream he had, inspired by the book that he was reading a lot, was to imagine himself as one of the great saints who had been before him. Often he imagined himself as Francis of Assisi and going on his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Now, he enjoys both daydreams when he looks back at them. So at first glance, if we take our very kind of simple introductory level of the examen, they both look like consolations. He enjoyed both of them, things to be grateful for. If we apply the simple terms of happy, sad, they're both happy. But however, only one of these daydreams leaves him feeling satisfied, and that's the daydream of him imagining himself as one of the saints. The other daydream, fun though it is at the time, leaves him feeling dry and lonely at the end. It is, in fact, a desolation dressing itself up. And that might relate, you might find yourself relating to that idea very quickly. These sorts of things are often the things that we do to self-soothe ourselves, to make ourselves feel slightly better in a moment without really tackling an issue head on. And we know that when we do that, we can often feel a bit empty at the end of it, no matter how much fun it was at the time. So they're desolations dressed up as consolations, but they're not real consolations. Consolations, the true ones, fill us up like a good meal. And when we return to the memory of the consolation, we're able to get the sense of being filled up once again. We should feel the weight of them in the prayer of the examen. And that's one of the real differences between consolation and desolation, is coming back to it in memory, which is why the examen is such a helpful prayer to explore it. So as I said, this is what Ignatius calls the discernment of spirits. And Ignatius writes a huge amount about this, and his fellow Jesuits and the Jesuits today continue to write a lot about the discernment of spirits. It's a wonderful area of study, and really is at the heart of Ignatius' spiritual exercises. There are lots of other different types of prayers that he teaches in his exercises. Discernment of spirits is at the heart of all of them, discerning what truly is gift of God, what truly leads us to the consoling love of God. Consolation moves us closer to God. So the moments of consolation are known as movements. They're movements of the Holy Spirit. Desolation, on the other hand, takes us away from God. So the moments of desolation in Ignatian practice are known as counter movements. So movements draw us closer to God, and counter movements draw us further away from God. Tuning into these moments, these movements and counter movements is subtle and takes practice. But the practice of noticing can mean that we're more quickly able to spot the movements of God's spirits around us in our everyday lives. And when we start to make big decisions in life, that's a really good skill to have. Now, as I say, there's been lots of writing around the discernment of spirits. There's some rich resources out there. I've put some resources up if you'd like to explore these terms, desolation and consolation, a bit more. One particularly good resource I'd recommend is an audio one. It's an episode of Beyond Belief that was on Radio 4 in September 2021, where 3 current day experts in Ignatian spirituality come up with a wonderfully pithy and helpful explanation of the discernment of spirits. So I'd recommend that, and I'll put a link to the BBC Sounds app in the link to this video. But if you just search around on the internet for Ignatian spirituality and discernment of spirits, you will find lots and lots of resources out there. Do take a look. The wonderful thing about Ignatian spirituality is Ignatius always intended it to be developed and adapted for its context. And thousands of people over the years have done just that. So there's some lovely resources out there. But your task this week is a simple one, which is to stay longer in the examen than you have been. So if you've been doing 5 minutes, my challenge to you is to try 10. And if you've been doing 10 minutes, my challenge is to try and stretch that to 15. And if you can get up to around about 15, 20 minutes, then that's a really lovely time to spend in the examen. Remember, you don't have to do this sitting still. If sitting still for 15 to 20 minutes just sounds very difficult, go for a walk. Go and enjoy some of our beautiful spring sunshine. Begin your time of prayer with a stimming exercise, the ones that we've been using in the last couple of weeks. And begin by inviting God in, asking for God's light to look over your day. Go through the steps of the prayer of the examen, looking back over your day and looking for the consolations and desolations. And then remember to end this time of prayer with a conversation with Jesus. Keep writing things down, and if you haven't started doing that, I'd really recommend you do it. At the end of the prayer time, just jot a few things down that occurred to you whilst you were praying. And it's amazing how quickly the clarity that comes from a time of prayer can dissipate. So do hold on to these treasures by jotting them down. Or you might want to write a poem or draw a picture or any other response to your prayer time that you would like. That's just for you. And as always, be gentle with yourself. Remember, the number one rule in this is to pray as you can and not as you can't. If the desolation of a day or a week is too much, don't dwell on it. Just stay in the consoling love of God. Focus on those movements which draw you closer to God. This is supposed to be an encounter with the God who loves you. It's not some punishing exercise. So have a go at a few different resources, find one that suits, and do have a look around on the internet for some other things that might suit you, as well as the resources that I've put up. I do hope you enjoy the examen prayer this week. And next week, we'll be developing the discernment of spirits into thinking about how we might make decisions and how we might take this form of prayer into our daily lives beyond the Lent course. Go well and God bless.